Geopolitics and Empire is joined by journalist and lecturer Matthew Ehret. He is the founder of the Canadian Patriot Review and writes for the Strategic Culture Foundation, an excellent website that is banned completely from some social media. You cannot even post their links to Twitter and Facebook. Welcome to the podcast for the first time, Matthew. How are you doing so far in 2021?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. And indeed, these are the times that try men's souls, as Thomas Paine once said.
Yeah, indeed. And that's what makes it kind of, it's depressing, but at the same time, exciting. And so I wanted to start by talking about something that you've been writing about for years. And this has also been, for me, one of my primary research focuses personally. I've been collecting books on this subject and reading about it for decades now. And that topic is global governance, which is a euphemism for world government or global government or even world state. There's a few books in my background. I know you have a big library, but I've got books scattered in boxes all across the planet. But I just to show, when we talk about this subject, it's not crazy. It's all documented, well over a century. I've got books from, 1942 talking about post-war worlds. I know you write a lot about, here's H.G. Wells' Open Conspiracy, where he talks all about this stuff, the idea of world government, just more, uniting of nations. At the top, it says world government. So, here they talk about ruling the world, an international constitution to rule the world, end of the nation state, right, and the formation of these regional kind of unions, from European Union to World Union, and even the late great Dr. Robert Pastor. I think I had the last interview with him before he passed away in January 2014. I interviewed him in December of 2013. The North American idea or North American Union. So, for me, this is the big enchilada. I find that all other events that we often discuss are in the service of attempting to bring about world government, whether it's the threat of nuclear war, so-called global warming, so-called international terrorism, and now so-called domestic extremism or terrorism, global financial crisis, so-called global pandemics. And, most of these problems are manufactured or prolonged by the same elites whose central goal is centralized control of the planet. So you've written many articles on this subject. There are many tangents one can go off on. There are many individuals, organizations, everything from Cecil Rhodes and the Roundtable Group, CFR, think tanks, foundations like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and their projects like the EU and Euro. So as best as you can, pulling together all of your knowledge and insight, could you give us kind of a concise or succinct tour through and summary of the striving for world government as you've followed it over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many entry points to discuss this. So I'm trying to think to myself as I was listening to you speak, what would be the most useful way of evaluating this topic for the minds of your audience? And I think that a paradox is a good place. And there's a paradox that recently arose with Vladimir Putin's January 2020 speech, where he first called for a new security architecture and also a new system. He actually called for a new system on January 15th in his State of the Union in Russia, founded upon the UN principles and the UN Charter. And he said we need to reestablish and reinforce the World Security, the UN Security Council, and we need the UN Charter to be a governing driver of how a world system of politics should be organized. This was repeated by Xi Jinping even more recently yesterday in his speech at Davos. He recently said, we need a system with the UN Charter enshrined. And a lot of attacks occurred because a lot of people who like generally the Multipolar Alliance, they like the idea of win-win cooperation of the Russia-China partnership, which has really, really taken off, especially since 2015 when the Eurasian Economic Union had their integration treaty, the first of several, with the Belt and Road Initiative. So a lot of people who sensed that this is an alternative to the unipolar system of the West, of the transatlantic, they were a bit confused because they're like, oh, wait, are these crypto globalists? This whole time, was I rooting for Xi Jinping and Putin, but they're actually crypto globalists who are fooling me? and this whole thing is a charade. Maybe the U.S. military is not actually engaged in a full spectrum dominance encirclement of Russia and China's perimeter. Maybe that's not true. And I had a lot of people, a lot of readers write into me. But I think when you actually go to the UN Charter and to really look at the original founding documents and look at the battles that were being had at the end of World War II from 1943, especially till 1945, you can start appreciating that it's not so simple to say all discussion of world government per se is all equal. It's not equal and it's not all the same. When you look at the UN Charter, one of the things that's very clear is that it's premised around the respect for the sovereignty of nation states. It's not like the League of Nations. The League of Nations was something which was designed in its fabric, in its constitution after World War I to supersede nation states, to render them impotent and null and void by basically giving the rights to controlling economic as well as military responsibilities to an unelected bureaucracy of specialists who would be operating through the Bank of International Settlements that was brought online by 1930. But then earlier on, the Bank of England was the sort of controlling financial mechanism. And the League of Nations was supposed to be the one world government. So the UN originally, under the idea of people like Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt, Wendell Willkie, many of the other American statesmen of that time, of the 1940s, they were anti-imperial. They consciously enshrined the respect for sovereignty of nations in the Charter. The idea of cooperation in order to solve international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and promoting and encouraging the respect for human rights. That was designed to be the center for the harmonizing of the actions of nations and the attainment of these common ends. So it's a very different idea of cooperation. And what Roosevelt wanted to do was to take the war on on Wall Street, the war on these great reset bankers of London who wanted to have their great reset in 1933 under the London Conference. He basically sabotaged all of that, and he reinstated the American Constitution as he brought bankers from Wall Street to prison he brought them in front of trial during the Pecora Commission. And he then created state credit through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation after regulating the banks and breaking up the too big to fail banks of Wall Street that created the Great Depression. So he did all of these things, which was always a political fight. It was never easy. It was always up against the most powerful fascist sponsoring financiers of the world. And he wanted to take that example and then make it available for every nation that had been colonized by the British Empire, which had been formerly the only one world government on the world for hundreds of years. It was really people before the 19th century. I mean, everyone understood that the real enemy, it wasn't communism versus capitalism, it was empire versus nation state. And people recognized that the American Revolution, what gave it the power was that it was a new type of society governed around the idea of the consent of the governed, the inalienable rights of every individual. That is what gave authority to the laws of the nation. That was never done before 1776. So the economic policies that arose out of the American experience, which was really driven by Benjamin Franklin, some of his proteges like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, they created an economic system premised around the rights of every sovereign nation to have a national bank, productive credit, protective tariffs to favor its local development of its industry so that they could stand on their own 2 feet economically and not be reliant on some powerful leviathan like the city of London always was, as the mother that would then give them some crumbs if need be. So this was better understood back then. Today, it's been really scrubbed out of our history books and people don't know how to think about that fight. But this is what Franklin Roosevelt and his allies tapped into when they configured the UN. Now, immediately, he died early in April 12th, 1945. All of his allies either died early, like Harry Hopkins, Wendell Willkie died early. Wallace was, destroyed politically. He was called a commie, and a lot of them were all expunged and purged from U.S. intelligence. The OSS was disbanded. And essentially all of the Churchill, the deep state department sort of took over control at that moment and started converting all of these Bretton Woods institutions that had originally been designed to be instruments for providing long-term development aid for nations to industrialize and stand on their own 2 feet in Africa, South America, and beyond. That was what the good neighbor policy was all about. That was all abandoned. And these things were increasingly turned, as we saw, into instruments for economic terrorism and subversion of national development throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s to today. So today we're at a place where you have sort of the realization that the system that the security architecture, the financial architecture that has been sort of guiding the world, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is coming to an end, that it's a big bubble. It's a chimera. We're going to see a meltdown of the financial system, and it's just been kept. They've been kicking the can down the line a little bit by just printing more money to bail out a little bit more, but it's completely unsustainable, and that's why the Great Reset agenda was brought online recently, summer last year, from the World Economic Forum. And this is you can't really understand what COVID-19 as a psychological operation is really about if you don't have that sense of how both of these things were coordinated from the top in order to keep people at homes, keep social movements relatively diffused and confused, so that as the system is being reset, they're able to stay in the driver's seat. The same oligarchs that created this problem decades ago are able to sort of keep in the driver's seat. The Russia-China alliance, the 139 nations or so that are signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, we can see very clearly by their policies, by their the program that they're committed to for long-term development, large-scale infrastructure, multipolarity, the respect for sovereignty of nations. This is really the revival of the original founding spirit of the United Nations as it was intended to be, and not as it became an increasing sort of tool to subvert nation states. So it's 2 different worlds, 2 different systems. We're going to have obviously a world, we're 8 billion, 9 billion people soon. We're not going to be able to live in a world where everybody's ignoring their neighbor. So you're going to have some form of way to moderate your relationships with the family of other nations and people. But is it going to be one that's based upon an operating system that forces people to conform their behavior to the will of an unelected bureaucracy of technocrats at the top, right? Or is it going to be one that actually respects the right for everybody to have their own developmental pathways, which is much more in harmony with what we see out of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Russia-China alliance more broadly?
Now, I had a question then, because I've been thinking about this, and I've had guests on. We wonder, where is this, geographically, the driving force, and there's a line, there's a Rubicon we can't go beyond, right? Like, who are these globalists? I like when Catherine Austin Fitts said, "Mr. Global," right? We can identify some of their front people, Bilderberger's Trilateral Commission, like you said, Wall Street, City of London. Saudi lobby, Israeli lobby, and all these people. But it keeps coming up time and time again, the British Empire or the remnants of the British Empire. So who would you say, at least in the West, where's the seat of this driving force for this, Western New World Order? Is it still the British Empire or the remnants of the British Empire?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is in so many ways, but the reason why people have a difficult time with this is because the British Empire isn't what they thought it was. They have a certain cartoonish idea that they've been given from media, from their popular history books, of what the British Empire was, as a bunch of, stuffy red coat wearing, militarists out, suppressing India with their military power, and the sun never sets. You got these sort of romantic ideas of what this thing was, and it's not at all like that. The empire itself was always an empire of the mind. It was an empire of intelligence agencies, British intelligence, going back to the days of Lord Shelburne. After that, Lord Palmerston. I mean, you have a certain tradition of recognizing how to utilize a technique of profiling your victims, how to manipulate Byzantine intrigue. There's a certain science and set of tactics that are passed down from one generation to another to maintain a continuity of system. You have also a banking empire. I mean, part of this thing has been through, especially in the last 350 so years, the city of London has been the nerve center of the world financial architecture. That didn't change. That's still the case today. It's not. This didn't disappear somehow after World War II, when apparently, as the myth was given to us, the American empire arose to replace the British Empire, which became, this, it agreed to just dissolve its former kingdoms and let the strong young up and coming republic become the new empire. No, that was a mythology cooked up by the enemies of the republic. But it's been a banking empire. It was an empire of penetration of organized corruption in every nation it would operate through. So to be able to create, let's say for the sake of India, here's a good paradox is, how was the British Empire with only, what was it, maybe 20,000 at max soldiers able to subvert for generations the entire Indian society, which had 300 million or so more people even. It was once the most powerful economy up until the 18th century, along with China. How was such a small number of British soldiers able to suppress that quantity of people, that powerful tradition, thousands of year old culture? And it was through understanding how to profile the weaknesses of the cultural matrix and amplify, let's say, for example, the caste system, so that they were able to create an organized structure of the Brahmins that they favored that would then self-organize that society and self-control that society. And then on the other hand, subvert that society's capacity to develop their own manufacturing. So they used to be leaders in textiles. That was all subverted through the Opium Wars with China, that whole period. And the Indian textiles were consciously destroyed through free trade as Britain took control in London of the production centers of textiles, leaving India to produce pretty much opium, which was very good for the British, because they then sent that to China to keep the Chinese dragon sort of at bay and weakened spiritually. It was calculated. And in so doing, they created triads, because who would do the work in China? So they had the creation of sort of, Chinese secret societies. Triads were formed that would be self-organized syndicates that would be then obedient and take directions from their British masters. We had the same thing inside of the United States with the formation of the KKK under Albert Pike, right, who was also the guy who reorganized the Grand Master Freemason, who reorganized Scottish Rite Freemasonry after the Civil War. He set up the KKK as a domestic terrorist group under the service of Mazzini and Palmerston in London. Why did he do that? It was to stop Reconstruction, right? To spread just an architecture of chaos and fear to break the Lincoln Ulysses S. Grant program for real full Reconstruction after the Civil War. This is what was revived later on under Woodrow Wilson and McKinley. Not McKinley. After McKinley died, you had Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt who revived this. So I think it's important to see the empire of the mind, of banking, and to see it as something that's directly continuous as a process. When you look at some of these inner families that tend to intermarry at the top, they could come and go. Some of them do stay there for a long time. And the point is, it's an artificial system that's ethically premised around the idea that your right to rule is based upon your blood. This goes back to ancient times. We've seen this philosophy that, if you're born into the right family, that's what gives you the right to rule. If you're born into the wrong family, that's what gives you the right to be a slave. Aristotle lays it out in his ethics, his Nicomachean Ethics, right? That there's one set of moralities for the slave and one set of moralities for the master. And that's how society should be organized. Plato disagreed with that. Plato, the guy who came before that, was always, no, look at look at a slave child in the Meno dialogue would be able, if taught correctly, even though that slave child did not have access to the elite education, they were able to be more creative and more intelligent by doubling the surface area of a square, just purely through their own powers of thought. Even more so than the slave master, Meno himself, that slave boy was able to make that discovery that the slave master couldn't do. So the slave master was intellectually inferior and spiritually inferior in power, even though he might have known more stuff than that boy was in that dialogue. So what you've got is something which goes back to the days of ancient Babylon, ancient Rome. And if you can only understand this thing when you start looking at these transition moments in these battles. So when did Greece become an empire, right? What was Socrates battling against when they killed him through the Democratic Party, right? That's what brought him to trial and forced him to drink the hemlock as a crime for corrupting the minds of the youth and undermining the doctrines of the state. It was at the moment when he was resisting just by simply asking questions and getting people to utilize their powers of mind. The core assumptions and truths of the experts, the sophists, who wanted to manage the society through the art of eloquent speech without any concern for truth. And this is what that society was turning into under Pericles. We saw what Greece was turning into, right? It had backstabbed its allies. It had basically started treating its allies formally as now colonies. And it was a real slide into deep corruption that resulted in that society not coming back from it. The same thing for Rome, right? When Cicero took a stand to try to preserve the Roman Republic, and Mark Antony ultimately cut off his head. What was Cicero doing? He was reviving the Socratic principles. All of his dialogues are written as dialogues, as Platonic dialogues, and he saw himself as continuing 250 years later the tradition of Plato and the Academy. And when he was killed, just like when Socrates was killed, that was sort of the shifting for the Roman Republic to become now the empire. And a lot of the same families that were running things like the cults of Delphi in Greece, the Apollo at Delphi, that was tied very closely to a lot of the cults that ran the financial structures as well of Persia, of Babylon. These sort of just migrated using the same techniques of, forming controlled, acceptable ideological cages that people could be a part of. You could worship whatever cult you wanted, but they had a problem when Christianity arose, and all of a sudden there was an idea that no, maybe there's actually one God, maybe there's one morality, maybe there's not one morality for the master and one for the slave, maybe there's like one higher universal truth that we all must submit to, and that was incompatible with the pagan system of the empire. So they've migrated, and you could sort of map out in some way, it's not always directly, we don't always have smoking guns all the way, but if you have your idea of history as a continuity of oneness, and you can focus on these transition moments. What was Augustine doing during the collapse of the Roman Empire? What was St. Augustine actually doing by reviving the Platonic method in his confessions and in all of his dialogues? He's writing as, again, it's a very Platonic system of communication and of teaching. And he's always organizing against this imperial thing all the way up through the migration of the ruling families after the Rome collapses into Venice and the lagoons of Venice, where they sort of set up shop for another 1,000 years, where Venice was. And I just wrote an article today, or I published it on my Substack, on the League of Cambrai, the 1508 League of Cambrai and the BRI today, how not to repeat history. And it really gets you across that finally, at a certain moment, Venice was known as the world center of finance. Just before the British Empire, it was Venice. And it was run by these families. They had organized themselves into committees of 2,000, organized by a committee of 10, organized by a committee of 3, with a doge. And they had control of global maritime traffic, global bullion trade. Everybody had to go to Venice. Venice was funding all sides of the wars when Protestantism was sort of manufactured to break up Christianity, because there was a battle happening within the church of all sorts of different factions with different views of the nature of man. A lot of wars proceeded for hundreds of years, and these bankers were funding all sides, happily laughing as their victims who had everything to gain by working together, which they did in 1508, where all of the victims of Venice finally worked together for a period of a couple of years, and they actually went to war and destroyed the Venetian navy. And just before they were going to go in with the death sort of on, like the sledgehammer, right before they could do that, Venice was able to orchestrate a series of back-channel amazing evil sabotages where they were able to get all of these allies to start killing each other. And all of a sudden, Venice, if you look after 1512, they're just the ally of everybody again. It's like, that gives you so much insight into how they were able to subvert these great potentials that arose again and again in historic time. And it also gives you an insight into what to be careful for today when we have, again, a convergence of different nations and cultures of the world who are realizing that, we have a lot of reasons to fight each other over land, territory, history, baggage, but we also have common enemies that have been fueling those fires artificially. And you actually have, through the Belt and Road Initiative, such a wonderful conjunction of different cultures, showcasing that the clash of civilizations doctrine is not the law of nations, of Samuel P. Huntington, but it could be sabotaged. And we've seen that as well with the United States. There's been a lot of weaknesses that the U.S. has shown since especially the death of JFK, but also with the ouster of Trump. We've seen that there was a bit of soul searching for the 4 years that Trump was the president, to rediscover what was really good about itself that it had forgotten when Bobby Kennedy was killed, and you didn't really have much resistance or goodness coming out of the USA for a long time. And then all of a sudden we had like these two Americas showcase a clash amongst themselves, right? So people, at least they've had that rekindled, and that's good. But only one of those Americas is compatible with being a partner, a trustworthy partner with the Belt and Road, with China and Russia. The other America that we've seen now assert itself under the takeover again by the whatever this thing is controlling Biden, it's not compatible. You need to get a completely different way of thinking about policy, ethics, government. It's totally a different universe that they're living in.
And yeah, this kind of brings us then, as you mentioned before, the Great Reset, the whole Project COVID Great Reset. And as you've kind of outlined, for those of us that understand this history, that understand world governments, the actors, their aims, and what we've seen now with COVID, how what you detail, this British infrastructure, global infrastructure, where they use the intelligence agencies, this psychological operations, the financial centers, and we've seen this with the COVID, where most nations of the world, they've been able to lock them down through this infrastructure. And we're at this kind of transition point. So we're moving from this British American kind of system now that's filled with debt that's about to collapse, to something else now. And are we approaching definitively finally their attempt at true global government? And so what's your take on what's happening with this Great Reset and COVID and going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to keep in mind that the empire themselves, it's premised around a certain ivory tower view of how human nature must be because we demand it to be so. Every time that these oligarchs, and you could trace this out, every time that they ever end up achieving the type of utopic system that they've been striving for, when they've done their assassinations, when they've orchestrated enough artificial wars, and when they've subverted their enemies enough, and they achieve that type of structure of power, of consolidation that they desire, whether it was in the case of the Roman Empire or whether it was in the case of Venice, we find that the same outcome is that it's only able to parasitically destroy the host that it sort of latches onto. Now, every good parasite knows you don't kill your host. That's not good for the parasite. They don't know how to do anything but destroy the foundations for their own existence. And they might think that it would be better if we were to have like sort of a modern day dark age and have a collapse of population to something more controlled. Now that might look good on paper if you're an imperialist, but to actually make that happen, especially with the additional factor of nuclear warheads all over the earth, it's really a video game. They think like it's a board game. The actual world that they live in is much messier and much more hostile to their own existence if that type of thing comes forth. I think that what we have, obviously, with the Great Reset is an attempt to go like flight forward. They're doubling down. They've been patient in a certain way for many decades, just sort of setting. It's kind of like the Fabian Society motto, I with the turtle, I don't. It takes me a long time to strike, but when I do strike, I strike hard. And a little funny that statement. Their other symbol for the Fabian Society is a wolf in sheep's clothing, which is the more famous one. Now they're doubling down. They're not going backwards, but they're also facing the reality that the script that they had been using for the last decades, especially with the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, that script is not working so well anymore. And especially it started breaking down after Gaddafi was assassinated. When they wanted 9/11, they got 9/11. When they wanted the Iraq War, they got the Iraq War. They wanted the Patriot Act, they got that too. They got pretty much everybody the population was induced to just go along with whatever the will of the oligarchy wanted. And up until Gaddafi's murder, that was the case. There was not a lot of resistance against that. There was some back channel maneuvering happening. Russia and China got together. They created the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They created what became the G20. There was like a survivors club of Eurasia that had sort of formed, but it wasn't still a serious force of resistance. That wasn't it. And then after Gaddafi, the target was set on Syria, and things stopped working. All of a sudden, China and Russia began utilizing their veto in the UN Security Council. That started creating these blocks. And even though Ukraine kind of went down with the way they wanted, not really. Russia was still able to keep control of Crimea. The world became, they never wanted the world to see how neo-Nazis were deployed and sponsored by the West. That was never supposed to be something that became publicly available as knowledge. And it became more of a messy thing. And then everything with the Belt and Road Initiative, since that was announced by 2013, everything that we've seen that evolve for the past 8 years almost, has been off script. So we've got these two competing systems. Now, the empire cannot blow out their current system in the West while that other system, that alternative financial architecture, is alive and thriving. They have to destroy that somehow. That's where I get a little bit of hope. I get a lot of hope, actually, because if I just look at the United States by itself right now, I honestly don't know what pathway. It's very new territory. It's very bad territory. There's not a lot inside of the U.S. currently that I see as being very hopeful currently. But again, I because I take a top-down evaluation first, I am very hopeful in that sense, because you do have so many nations of the world all uniting around a viable alternative, and they're all saying no to depopulation, no to one world government. They're paying lip service in some ways to the whole COVID thing coming out of the Great Reset, but paying lip service and actually passing through policies that are depopulation are two very different things. So I'm not seeing any of these nations giving up those rights for sovereign development pathways, for open system versus closed system economics. What we do know is that the imperial crowd running the Great Reset, because your audience knows this, but just to recap, they're trying to say, okay, we need to take the whole fight against global warming to decarbonize the world by 2050, supposedly in order to bring down world climate by a degree or 2 degrees or something, which is actually just not only is it not scientific, if you do the things that the Green New Dealers in the Great Reset crowd are actually saying you should do, you will destroy society's ability to sustain, forget 7 or 8 billion people, you could barely sustain 1 or 2 billion people by going for that quality of windmills and solar panels everywhere. That quality of energy is incompetently bad on so many levels. You can't harness the quality of heat required for a capital intensive industrial civilization, which is what you need if you're going to have this quantity of people at a certain quality of life. You have to have a certain ability to deploy and direct vast amounts of quality heat and energy, not just for your house, but really for industrial needs too. That won't be there. It only kind of works under this idea of a consumer society that's not productive forever at a highly reduced number. So anyway, they're trying to combine that with the COVID response. And we know that China has offered, their system is an open system. They've offered every country of Africa, South America, North America, Europe, an ability to participate and jump on board with that new operating system that is not run by the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, and other things. It's a different architecture. So it's open. And I think as things get worse and people realize that this fire is not a dream, it's touching their skin. If that's where the survival instincts from people who are currently sort of sleepwalking or docile are going to increasingly kick in. We've already seen examples of that, but it hasn't been durable. And when you look at what the options are, either like hell on earth under a depopulation world government Great Reset, or a world of development, science, technology, space exploration that's coming out of the Russia-China alliance, I think people are going to organically, as a matter of just being human beings with children, like we're creatures that are wired for self-preservation. If we're not ideologically cultish, like some of these Malthusian technocrats are, unfortunately. But for the most part, the natural human instincts that we're born with imply to me that you will get more positive receptivity to nations jumping on board that future-oriented system rather than sticking with the Titanic.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think recently, as a result of COVID, up in Canada, where you are, they created like 12 concentration camps, these COVID detention camps. So if things start to get really bad, in the West, are you going to then head out to Eurasia?
Well, at the very least, who knows, man? I gotta say, you got to keep your options on the table, but. Yeah, no, it's certainly, there's one of the sad things with the QAnon phenomenon, and I don't want to speak too much about this, but one of the problems was that it's obviously a psyop cover, and so many people who write to me, who read my stuff, they're obviously they want to believe, in the QAnon sort of promises. But a big one that I kept on getting was people saying, oh yeah, all of these FEMA camps, all of these detention centers, it's great. You might seem scary at first, but it's actually really good because this is actually the Q guys, the good deep state who's setting all of this up to prepare for putting in Hillary Clinton and all of these bad guys. It's like, no, guys, it's for you. Like, really think about this.
Yeah. I mean, that was
celebrate this, Yeah,
that was a total counterintelligence operation. The whole QAnon line, and to set honeypot set up, to create a pretext for this domestic terrorism. Now, and that was a question. Well, before I get to the whole the domestic terror, if we get time, on your point of Belt and Road in Eurasia, I've lived for years in Eurasia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia. I've been to Russia, and the devil's advocate in me, the skeptic as well. Those are. The whole former Soviet bloc, Kazakhstan does still have this kind of authoritarian system. I mean, living and working there, it's fine if you work and live and mind your own business. It's great, no problems. But people are afraid to talk about politics. For example, let's just say in Kazakhstan, and you kind of don't want to go against the system and China as well. I think if you live and work and live your own life, I guess you're okay. But then. Let's say, Belt and Road and the Eurasian Union develop and get bigger. Is there also this threat that it could become more authoritarian over time? And, we have that social credit system, technocratic system in China. So for people who look at the grass is greener, kind of, the whole Western technocracy, Great Reset, the British Empire, deep state system that we're now seeing, we think grass is greener out east. Is there also the danger that breed could evolve into a more dystopian system?
Oh yeah, there's always a danger. Like with human beings, we're not a mathematical formula, right? Like there's no formula for success for humans. So it's really a question of culture and respect for the past and respect for the future. That's the saving grace for human beings. The animals, they're really like, genetic driven, instinct driven, environment driven creatures. They're adaptable, but they don't have a sense in your bear species or my great great grandparent bear or my great great grandchild bear, and I'm going to sacrifice my great great grandchildren after I die. That's not really there. It's not available for them in that sense. Human beings, because we have that's the foundation for all. Either are there cultural movements, educational institutions, the creation of artistic, scientific institutions that are going to either make you better or make you worse. Because there's two, it's politically charged. And there are some cultural matrices that are constantly promoted in order to make the slaves think they're free, but actually just love their chains. The whole, much of the 20th century, unfortunately, is very much shaped artificially by social engineers who had a sense of how do you get people to really just give their identity entirely into sensual gratification and think that that's your capitalist free state. That's the sort of thing that grew out of Aldous Huxley's research from the Brave New World, which was not about fiction. They did it. That was, LSD and the entire drug culture came out of MK Ultra as part of this entire operation to think how do you create a society that again loves their chains, and will fight for them. The thing I think that is important is that when Justin Trudeau or Klaus Schwab or let's say one of the U.S. Deep state Bidenites speaks well of China, what they tend to like is what you just said. They like the part of that centralized control. They like that. They like the social credit stuff. They like the surveillance architecture that could be deployed. They don't like, that's the part that they want to say, is all China should be doing. That's what they wish they had access to control their masses who have a little bit too much of a taste for democracy in the West. They don't like the part where China is committed to large-scale development, anti-degrowth, pro-population growth. They don't like that, or their respective sovereign nations. Like when China, if you look at the new regional regional economic cooperation,
RCEP, yeah.
Thank you. Partnership. Yeah, partnership. When you look at that thing, which is like one of the biggest trade agreements in the world ever in history, comprising 30% of the world GDP and population, it's all based upon the respect for the developmental pathways of each participant nation. It's the same thing for Africa, and they get a lot of flack by the George Soros affiliated UN human rights groups and stuff like that, or Human Rights Watch. They get attacked for saying like, well, oh yeah, but you're cooperating with the corrupt governments of the countries that you want to build infrastructure in. Bad. You're supposed to do what we do and make good governance happen first. You give them a loan on the basis that they restructure their governments the way the IMF wants it, and then maybe you can offer them some development. You don't do it the other way first. You don't offer development and then maybe get rid of corruption. And China's like, no, just get development, get the thing done. Like there's people who are dying. Like every year, how many children die of hunger unnecessarily and famine, right? So there's a concept of human self-interest organizing the macro program for the Belt and Road, which is something the empire hates and fears and wants to destroy. And that's why George Soros, in his January 2020 Davos speech, he made the point that the two greatest threats to his open society is Donald Trump's USA and Xi Jinping's China. So these are the two greatest threats. So you got to see what is it that they see as a threat. It's not the authoritarian aspect of their centralized governments that they don't see as necessarily a threat. What they see as a threat is the active concepts governing their large-scale macroeconomic programs and also their security architecture. Like China doesn't have a global, they have one military base outside of China in Djibouti. They don't have global military ambitions to take over the world. The U.S. has 750 or I don't know how many 800 military bases that are actually applying subversive programs for cultivating jihadi groups and neo-Nazis and other things. So it's a different concept. Now, can it be corrupted? Maybe it can. Not maybe. Everything can be corrupted. The question is, it's like, think of yourself like in periods of my life. I see economics, the organism of mankind as kind of like myself, a macro version of myself as an individual. And there's periods in my life where I was becoming a worse person. And I could think of periods of my life where I was happy with myself and becoming a better person. And if you think about, well, what were the common denominators amongst those periods of decay of my moral, conceptual inner constitution? It was when I was not growing anymore. I stopped. I wasn't learning. I gave into a way of being of bad habits, right? Bad addictions, things like that zapped my vigor, my curiosity, my awe, my love, my ability to love and empathize was reduced spiritually. When I was learning, when I started giving myself into that commitment to be in a state where I'm learning new techniques, I'm learning new painting skills, I'm learning new things, and I'm trying to teach as well. I could find all of a sudden a clarity in my focus, a clarity in my ability to use my mind, to use my feelings, and to just have judgment, right? That I could trust a bit more and more. So I think of that sort of as a society as well. If a society goes into stagnation, and there's so many ways to stagnate, to stop striving for something better for the people. You can be corrupted. You're more inclined to be subverted from within. The empire has all sorts of ways to identify and to encourage those sorts of attributes to one of their victim target societies. And that allows that society to actually self-destruct increasingly. That's what happened to the United States after the Civil War, right? When the British tried on many occasions during the 19th century to destroy the USA militarily from the War of 1812. The Civil War was again the British aspect, the City of London financiers, the British military were providing warships to the Confederate South. They were providing weapons, money, all sorts of things. They were providing assassination cover. terrorist cover from Canada, from where they provided the Confederate secret headquarters, all of their Montreal and Toronto. They gave them full access to their intelligence agencies in Canada so that they could run operations against Lincoln from the north. And Lincoln still persevered because he understood the nature of the game very well, even though he died. And his assassin was deployed to kill him from Montreal, John Wilkes Booth. And they found a banknote from the head of the Bank of Ontario, Henry Starnes, in his room, directly as payment for the deed. So when the British couldn't any longer, when they realized that they couldn't physically destroy their targets militarily in the old-fashioned way, their focus became more, how do we corrupt it and subvert it from within? Could they do that with China? Maybe they could do that with Russia. They could do it with anybody, as long as these countries give up on their future. Now, I would just add one more thing to that. When China originally opened up it began sort of, I guess you could say, with Kissinger opening things, right? In 1972, I believe, under Nixon. Am I right?
Somewhere in the 70s. I don't know the year.
Yeah. At the time under Mao, what the British wanted at the time, because what was happening, they were rewiring the system of the world so that the former industrial nations would now, under the new set of liberalized economic ethics, they would outsource their former industrial and manufacturing bases to poor countries, and the poor countries would do cheap labor for Western consumer markets, and that became what was known as the post-industrial society. Now, Henry Kissinger was a big player in making that happen by floating the U.S. dollar from the fixed exchange rate, the gold reserve, and floating it to the world markets. That was a big way to get that pivot into the new paradigm. But in his world, he wanted the world to be forever divided by a productive class of poor people who would be too poor to consume what they produce, and cheap goods being sent into former productive zones, which would just be consumer and would never be able to produce what they used to produce for themselves. So it would be like an addiction of cheap labor always. And he wanted the world forever divided under this type of strict haves and have-nots duality. That was a nice way to keep balance in his mind and his controllers, because he represented a higher, it's a whole other discussion. So he wanted what we saw with the Cultural Revolution. Mao was sort of torn between, since 1949, he was sort of torn between two opposing factions within China. You had the Zhou Enlai faction, which represented a sort of a much more pro-industrial, pro-development orientation. Zhou Enlai was one of the architects of the Bandung Conference with Jawaharlal Nehru in 1955, which set up the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Right? It was sort of a recapitulation of the Westphalian principles of the benefit of the other, of forgiveness, of mutual development, of harmony of nations. He in so many more ways embodied the spirit of Sun Yat-sen, the first president of China, in his overall thinking and strategizing. Now, his enemies were known as the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four and he were always battling it out. One of Zhou Enlai's prodigies was a young guy named Deng Xiaoping. So you had these two factions, and at different times, Mao would vacillate from one to the other. He'd be influenced by one, and at a certain point, he went along with the Gang of Four, and that became the Cultural Revolution, which was just a total mess. It was a disaster, which many Chinese even today are still suffering from as scar. Now, Kissinger, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who also went to China, they love that part of the Gang of Four Cultural Revolution as being like this permanent state of equilibrium. And when they said, okay, we'll shake hands and you're going to start doing the production, Mao died. The Gang of Four, there was a coup. So Zhou Enlai died, Mao died same year, but immediately Deng Xiaoping took the helm and the Gang of Four were all put in prison. And he gave people the right to finally criticize Mao. And he basically said to the people, we cannot treat Mao as a superhuman, as a god. He's a human and he made mistakes, and you're allowed to criticize that. That was a big sort of spiritual healing. It wasn't the full-blown package, but it was still like a good step. And in Deng Xiaoping's mind, he had a much more long view of development than Kissinger did. And he understood that, okay, we're going to have to take China from a third world country of total poverty and leapfrog by copying Western technologies as much as we possibly can, so that we can leapfrog what the US did in 300 years. We got to do it in like a generation or two. And he laid out a whole program to make that happen. And now, as we see, because he was thinking, and it's part of the Chinese matrix, they just tend to think on much longer waves of history, even longer than Kissinger. And Kissinger thinks in very long waves of history. He thinks about, the Peace of Westphalia of 1646 or 49.
48, I think.
48, yeah. He thinks of that in a way which is like an active thing, an organizing thing in his strategizing. People think, wow, that's incredible. You're so brilliant as a geostrategist. The Chinese are fucking thinking about thousands of years ago as well, and thousands of years in the future. So a lot of the Western oligarchy didn't understand that. And they hated the fact that the Gang of Four agenda was no longer the hegemonic approach. So again, I think if you're always focusing upon new discoveries, elevating the conditions of human beings through economic development and scientific and technological progress, if that's always your commitment to go beyond the horizons of knowledge and then leap into the unknown, and then transmit that into your system that allows you to sustain more people at a higher quality of life, your political economic system is going to reciprocally change for the better or for the worse with the betterment or the worseness of your culture. So I think that all of society is sort of a motion towards better or worseness. It's not like there's China as it is now and always will be, or the West as it is now and always will be. It's always a flux, like language.
Like a living thing.
Yeah.
I guess last question in the interest of time, since this is where we are at in the conversation. So then, do you think Bretton Woods will go to war with Belt and Road? Basically, Bretton Woods system is dying. It's got this great reset now. You think there's going to be, a World War III scenario?
It's possible. I mean, I think that, what was his name? The French finance minister last year made the point that if we don't save the Bretton Woods, then China's renminbi will be the basis for the New World Order. And he said that as a warning. That's unacceptable. We can't allow that. Right now, I always like the polemic that if you go back the way I did at the beginning of this conversation to history and you look at the original basis of the Bretton Woods organization originally with the UN in 1944 to 45 and 46, before the Cold War, but that period of dense fighting over what it was going to be. The IMF, the World Bank were originally, these are Bretton Woods institutions. The fixed exchange rate system was part of that fabric that was designed by Henry Dexter White, Roosevelt's anti-imperial ally. These were all designed to ensure that you would have stability of the system, that you would not have speculation on poor nations' credit. So that was what the fixed exchange rate is all about. Because you could kind of know what the variability of the prices of the value of a local currency were into the future, so that you could plan long term. You didn't want to just have people thinking about the next quarter. Those institutions were all originally designed to be the expression of the full spectrum creation of economies around the world that could all stand on their own 2 feet. So every individual nation would have the access to the New Deal type of programs of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the electrification projects of the U.S. experience, the Hoover Dam projects, all of these things would be made available. And technology transfers were very much clearly on the table, as we saw with Mexico, with Brazil, with Argentina, and their delegations at the Bretton Woods Bretton Woods Conference, which were all adopted and endorsed by Harry Dexter White and Roosevelt. John Maynard Keynes, who represented the Bank of England and the British Empire, were completely in opposition to the idea, all of those ideas. They wanted a one world currency, or a basis of one world currency called the Bancor, run by the Bank of England. They wanted no technology transfer, no industrial development for poor countries. Basically, they wanted the U.S. to serve and protect the new British Empire, and it ended up being that's sort of what happened, with a bit of a sleight of hand. Now, I think an irony is that the actual heir to the Bretton Woods traditions is the Belt and Road, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Chinese Export-Import banks. That entire economic architecture is behaving the way that Roosevelt and Harry Dexter White intended it originally to be. That's, conditionality-free long-term loans for real development for poor countries. They're actually training generations of engineers in Africa and Kenya and Nigeria. We see it. I follow this. They're doing things that the IMF and World Bank never permitted. No development of the minds of people that you're going to go and exploit. Never. So I think that if the West as a whole is going to be able to find its soul back, recognizing that those are the traditions that are activated and that are in its own benefit, that they're welcome to join, whether it's space exploration as well, asteroid defense, which China and Russia's space programs are very concerned with, as are Japan, as are India. They're talking seriously about an asteroid defense. It's one of these outside the box concepts that changes our idea of geopolitics, economics, value, what can and cannot be, new discoveries. There are things that are outside of the closed system that we're in, which offer conceptual pathways to solving problems, which you don't have if you're just locking your mind within the game plan. The game masters have it all set up. You're fucked. Sorry for the language, but you can't win. So you have to think on those higher outside the system terms, and then you can avoid nuclear war. But if you look at the better, we'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, Dark Age ideologues who are, they have a lot of influence and power right now in the West. They're willing to risk launching a nuclear war that they don't mind the risk of it abolishing and destroying them too. There's kind of, I think, a suicidal impulse in their own organizational structure. So that's something, again, people, this is not fiction. This is not a Hollywood movie. We're living in history right now.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, studying history, people don't understand the sinister and evil nature of some of these people in power. And, we've seen during the Korean War, we've had, who was it, General MacArthur, who wanted to nuke China. And then we've had during the Cuban Missile Crisis that, Pentagon Joint Chiefs who were ready to nuke Russia. And so throughout history, we have this group of people that are just, as you said, just willing, I guess, to watch the world burn. And so that's why I always feel like there's this propensity that things will go there. They definitely can go there. And as you said, we don't know what's going to happen, but I think we'll leave it there for now, and hopefully you'll join us in the future. You're a guest that you've got all those books behind you. You've got this history of writing your articles that really go deep. You've got so many sources. You're well read, and so we could talk for hours. And so we'll leave it there for now. Your website is CanadianPatriot.org. You've got a great YouTube channel that I just discovered that's got a lot of material and interviews there. Is there any other website or project that we should know about?
Yeah, and thank you for advertising those. I recommend also people have a look at the nonprofit organization that I created last year with my wife Cynthia, who's also a writer at Strategic Culture and the Canadian Patriot. It's risingtidefoundation.net. And there's a lot of videos, weekly lectures that we do. People, if they write in, they can receive an invitation to our weekly Zoom meetings. There's just a lot of educational material, and it's a little bit more focused upon culture, science, education. The Canadian Patriot is a little bit more hard-hitting, controversial stuff. They both go together, though. They work nicely as an ensemble. And also, I recently set up a Substack. So if people want to subscribe to the Substack or just make a donation, then that's also there on the sites.
All right. I read just about every one of the articles you put out on Strategic Culture. So I do recommend people bookmark your sites. I'll include the links. And so thanks again for being on Geopolitics and Empire. Thanks for having me on. I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.